In the dying winter of 1945, Bavaria lay silent beneath a white shroud of snow. Villages that had once waved Nazi flags now stood hollow, their chimneys dead, their people starving. The air was still, broken only by the crunch of footsteps in the snow, the echoes of a world that had been torn apart. Somewhere down the winding road, the distant rumble of engines broke the quiet. American trucks, their olive-green paint caked with mud, rolled forward through the wintry landscape. Inside the trucks, no bombs nor soldiers ready for battle. Only boxes labeled U.S. Army rations, the lifeline of hope for a population exhausted by war. The villagers, their faces gaunt from hunger, stood frozen in place as they watched the convoy approach. Every breath was a fragile reminder of survival, and as the wind howled across the icy plains, the villagers could not help but wonder, would these be the monsters they had been told about, or the salvation they had secretly prayed for? The winter of 1945 marked the bitter end of a conflict that had ravaged Europe for nearly 6 years. As the Allies closed in from all directions, Germany's once formidable war machine had crumbled, leaving behind a nation in chaos. The Third Reich, under the brutal leadership of Adolf Hitler, was no more than a shadow of its former self. In the east, Soviet forces pushed relentlessly towards Berlin, and in the west, American and British armies had crossed the Rhine, driving deep into German territory. By the time the Americans reached Bavaria in early 1945, the region was in a state of utter disarray. The German military was in retreat, and the civilians left behind were caught in the devastating aftermath of the war. The countryside, once vibrant with life and industry, was now decimated. The remnants of German soldiers, many little more than children, limped through snow-covered streets, their uniforms tattered, their faces hollowed by exhaustion. In the villages, food had become a precious commodity, hidden away in the corners of homes, stored beneath floorboards like treasures. Rations had fallen below 1,000 calories per day, and bread, a basic staple, had become a luxury. Even the animals had been consumed for survival, with cats long gone from the village, hunted for their meat. The war had forced the people of Bavaria to survive on whatever they could find. Families lived in constant fear and uncertainty, not knowing if they would ever see peace. The church bell that had once rung with the cadence of daily life stood silent in the cold winter air, its clapper frozen, symbolic of the death of a way of life. The elderly, the women, and children were the only ones left, haunted by the absence of fathers and brothers who had gone off to fight, many never to return. It was into this landscape of despair that the American convoy rolled, bringing with it the hope of something more than destruction. But, for the villagers, these were still the same men who had been demonized in the Nazi propaganda, soldiers who had been painted as enemies to be feared and despised. As the convoy of American trucks made its way through the snow-covered Bavarian countryside, the Reich was collapsing in slow, painful waves. News of Hitler's imminent defeat spread across Europe, though it hardly provided comfort to the residents of these broken villages. The promises of victory, the speeches of national glory, and the assurances that the war was far from over were distant memories. The reality on the ground was one of desperation and starvation. The soldiers who had once marched proudly under the swastika were now little more than ghosts of their former selves. Many were young boys, not even of age, drafted into the Wehrmacht to fight a war they hardly understood. Those who had survived the brutal Eastern Front or the Allied air raids were now retreating, some without ammunition or leadership. The soldiers who stumbled through Bavarian streets in early 1945 had lost their will to fight, tired, hungry, and broken. They no longer represented the might of a nation, but the fragility of a dying empire. Meanwhile, on the home front, the civilians had been fed a constant stream of lies. Nazi propaganda portrayed the Allies as ruthless invaders, bent on the destruction of Germany and its people. The Americans were no exception. They were depicted as barbaric, cruel, and heartless, monsters who would bring nothing but death and devastation. But as the war dragged on, this narrative began to crumble under the weight of the reality the villagers faced. Their hunger was unbearable, their suffering too much to be concealed by political rhetoric. The local leadership, discredited and defeated, no longer held the sway it once had. Some villagers clung to old allegiances, still loyal to the ideals of the Reich, while others faced the stark truth that the war had failed. The church, once a place of unity and strength, had become a silent witness to the horrors around it. Its bell stilled, its congregation fractured. Rumors swirled in the community. The Americans were advancing. Would they bring the promises of food? Or would they carry out the grim orders to burn villages, destroy what was left, and show no mercy? The villagers didn't know which version of the story to believe. The tension grew, and the atmosphere became thick with fear and hope in equal measure. In this fragile moment of uncertainty, the villagers, their hearts divided between terror and longing, awaited the unknown. The children, too young to comprehend the full scale of the war, continued to play their games, pretending to be soldiers as their parents whispered in hushed voices. For them, the approaching convoy was not just an army, but a harbinger of change. Martia had lived through it all. The first wave of optimism, the endless propaganda, the promises of victory. Now, in the bitter winter of 1945, she was a mother trying to hold her family together in the midst of despair. Her husband, once a soldier, was gone, lost in the chaos of the war. Her son, Emil, no older than 7, had only known a world ravaged by conflict, a world where food was scarce, and every day felt like a struggle for survival. In the dim light of their small home, Martia's hands, red and raw from the cold, hovered over a pot of water. Inside it sat a single shriveled potato, the last remnant of their meager supply. She tried to distract Emil, to keep him from the hunger that gnawed at him, but there was little to offer. The cold air was filled with the sound of every breath, a reminder that even the most basic human needs had become a luxury in the dying days of the Reich. Her son, Emil, watched the empty road outside their window. His coat, 2 sizes too large, hung loosely around his thin frame. He asked her, his voice barely a whisper, if his father would return. Martia had no answer. There were no words that could soothe him, no words that would make him understand the horrors that had taken his father away. And in her heart, she knew the answer. He would not return. In that moment, Martia's world was reduced to the tiny space they occupied, the warmth of a single fire, and the flickering hope that somehow the war might end, if not for her, then at least for Emil. She clung to memories of the farm they once had, to the smells of apples and the sound of her husband's laughter. But even those memories were fading, worn thin by the passage of time, the slow death of hope. The arrival of the American convoy was a strange kind of salvation. Martia felt fear as much as she felt relief. She had heard the rumors, stories of American brutality, of towns burned to the ground, of women violated and children killed. She had also heard whispers of food, of the possibility of survival. She had no idea which of these stories was true. But when Emil heard the rumble of engines approaching, his wide-eyed wonder pulled her from her thoughts. For the Americans, the convoy's mission was clear: provide humanitarian aid, prevent famine, and maintain peace in the wake of Germany's defeat. As part of the civil affairs units, the soldiers who arrived in Bavaria were not there to fight, but to provide the relief that the region so desperately needed. Their orders were simple, but their task was not. The soldiers who unloaded the trucks in the snow were tired, some barely older than the children they saw playing in the streets. These were not the battle-hardened veterans of the previous years of fighting. They were young, weary men who had crossed France, Belgium, and the Rhine. Now, as they moved through a frozen, desolate land, They were faced with something no one had truly prepared them for: the emotional toll of delivering mercy. For Lieutenant Harper, the leader of the convoy, the mission had taken on a deeper meaning. He had read the reports: millions displaced, cities destroyed, a whole generation lost. But none of that had truly prepared him for the faces he would encounter in the villages. As the convoy rolled through the Bavarian landscape, it became clear that his soldiers would not just be handing out rations. They would be the bearers of hope in a place where hope had long since been buried. The convoy moved slowly, its trucks laden with food, blankets, and medical supplies. The soldiers, cautious but determined, began distributing the supplies, watching carefully as villagers came forward. The goods, cans of milk, tins of meat, powdered eggs, were miracles in tin for those who had not seen a proper meal in months. The soldiers, some of whom had never seen true hunger, understood the importance of their task, though the emotional weight of it was not lost on them. As they moved through the village, some soldiers smiled, offering small gestures of kindness. They handed out chocolate, blankets, and cans of food, all while speaking in broken German, trying to bridge the gulf of language and culture. But the villagers were wary, unsure whether this was just another trick, another illusion of hope that would quickly be dashed. Lieutenant Harper stood at the edge of the square, surveying the scene before him. His mission was clear: provide aid to the civilians and prevent the spread of famine in this war-torn region. But as he watched his men distribute the rations, something inside him shifted. This was no ordinary military operation. This was something deeply human. Harper had read the reports of the devastation in Germany, the millions displaced, the cities in ruins, the broken infrastructure. But none of that could truly prepare him for the faces of the villagers, for the quiet desperation that filled the air. These people had endured horrors that no one should ever have to face. They had watched their country crumble, their families torn apart, and their homes reduced to rubble. Yet here they were, standing before soldiers who had once been painted as their enemies, accepting food from hands that had held guns only months before. The situation weighed heavily on Harper. He had been trained to lead his men in battle, to fight for victory, to uphold the ideals of the American cause. But standing here, in the heart of a broken village, he realized that victory had a new meaning. It was not defined by flags or treaties, but by the simple act of feeding those who had been forgotten, by offering kindness where there had been only cruelty. For Harper, the mission was no longer about defeating the enemy. It was about healing the wounds of a war that had left deep scars on both sides. His thoughts often returned to the question, how do you lead when the enemy is no longer an abstract concept, but a person, a mother, a child who has suffered just as much as your own people? As the convoy prepared to leave, Harper found himself lingering at the edge of the village. He spoke to the translator who had been bridging the gap between languages and asked him to convey a simple message to the villagers. Tell them we are not here to hurt them. We are just tired of fighting. It was a sentiment that felt both foreign and deeply personal. In a world where so much had been taken, he realized that sometimes the greatest gift a soldier could offer was not a victory, but a moment of peace. As the Americans distributed rations and blankets, something unexpected began to happen in the village. The atmosphere shifted from one of suspicion to one of tentative hope. In the span of just a few hours, the villagers, who had once seen the Americans as invaders, began to view them in a different light. For Martia, the moment when her son, Emil, received a tin of milk was transformative. The cold, hard reality of war had turned her into someone who had learned to live with loss and fear, but this small act of kindness shattered that armor. It was as if the walls around her heart, built from years of propaganda and pain, began to crack. She looked at the American soldier who had handed Emil the milk and saw not the enemy, but a human being. The kind of soldier she had been taught to fear was now the one offering a piece of her own survival. the scene was repeated across the village. The soldiers, once viewed as enemies, were now offering something that the villagers had lost long ago: mercy. They handed out bread, cans of food, and blankets, and in the process began to rebuild something that had been lost in the fog of war: trust. But not everyone was ready to accept this mercy. At the edge of the square, a former local party official, Kruger, stood with his arms crossed, watching the proceedings with a look of quiet disdain. His face was tight, his posture rigid, and his eyes betrayed the turmoil within. "They humiliate us," he muttered, as he watched the villagers accept food from the Americans. "We were the proud ones once, and now look, begging from the enemy." Kruger's words echoed through the crowd, stirring unease. Some of the villagers whispered among themselves, torn between the old loyalties that still lingered and the new reality that was being presented before them. The Germans had been told for years that the Americans were monsters, that they would bring destruction and terror. But now, faced with the tangible reality of kindness, of bread and milk, the narrative they had been fed began to unravel. Even as some resisted, the moral impact of the American actions could not be denied. The soldiers, though they had been trained for battle, had shown the villagers a different side of warfare, one where compassion could win battles that weapons never could. The divide between the soldiers and the civilians, once steeped in hatred, began to narrow. The villagers, uncertain and fearful, were forced to confront a new truth. Not all enemies were the same, and not all soldiers wore the same face. The snow continued to fall, soft and relentless, as the convoy remained in the village, its engines still rumbling in the cold. The men who had crossed through Europe, fighting tooth and nail for every inch of land, now found themselves in a quiet, unexpected battle, one not for territory or power, but for the hearts and minds of the villagers they had come to help. As the last of the crates were unloaded and the villagers gathered the food, there was an unmistakable shift in the air, a palpable change that hung between the silence of the past years and the tentative hope of the present. Martia, still holding the blanket that had been placed in her arms, stood at the edge of the square, watching the scene unfold. Her thoughts drifted to the stories she had heard about the American soldiers, the fear, the violence, the promises of devastation. But now, before her, stood not monsters but men, tired, weathered men who offered not death but bread. She turned to Emile, clutching his hand tightly, feeling something stir within her that she hadn't allowed herself to feel for years. A flicker of something almost like hope. It was then that the moment of the turning point arrived, sudden and clear. Emile, who had been watching the soldiers from a distance, took a hesitant step forward, his small hand stretching out towards a soldier holding a tin of milk. The soldier, seeing the boy's longing, knelt down and smiled. He handed the can to Emile, who, in his innocence, looked at it as if it were something magical. For the first time in what seemed like forever, Emile's face broke into a wide smile. The milk was real, tangible, a reminder of something long lost, something as simple as food, but also as profound as humanity. The villagers, too, began to thaw. They watched as their children played, as the soldiers shared food, as the tension slowly melted away. The idea of enemy and invader began to dissipate, replaced by something more human, the acknowledgement of shared suffering, and in that suffering, the potential for connection. But the moment that would forever change the course of the village's history wasn't just the distribution of food, it was the way the soldiers treated the people. There was no judgment in their eyes, no condescension, just simple acts of kindness. One soldier, with hands frozen from weeks of travel, bent down to hand a piece of chocolate to a little girl. Another paused to rub the feet of an elderly woman whose bare toes were frozen from walking the snow-covered streets in search of food. These were small, almost unnoticed gestures, but they held immense weight. And then came the most pivotal act of all. Lieutenant Harper, standing at the center of the village, his face soft with a weariness that only those who had fought wars could understand. He addressed the villagers, his voice calm but heavy with emotion. Through the translator, he conveyed the message. "We are not here to hurt you. We are just tired of fighting. We bring you food, peace, and a chance to rebuild." The weight of his words hung in the air, resonating deeply with the villagers. This was not the end of a battle. This was the beginning of something else entirely. A moment when enemies became humans again, where soldiers became bearers of something far greater than weapons. As the convoy prepared to leave the village, the soldiers, exhausted but fulfilled in a way they had not expected, climbed into their trucks. The engines roared to life, the rumble of their departure a stark contrast to the quiet that had once filled the village. The villagers stood in the road, some watching with curiosity, others with newfound gratitude. Private Ray Thompson, who had never expected to find such peace in a place like this, walked toward Martia and Emil, his steps slow and thoughtful. He had seen much in the war, but never this kind of tenderness. As he reached Martia, he handed her a small package, wrapped in brown paper. "For you," he said simply, his voice carrying a note of kindness that had been absent from his words during the fighting. Inside the package were small, simple items, a bar of soap, a comb, and a letter. The letter, written in careful German, was a message from a mother back home, one Ray had carried with him across the battlefield. The translator read it aloud. "The war is over. Build again. Teach your children to be kinder than we were." Martia pressed the letter to her chest, her hands trembling. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not cry. The words resonated deep within her, a call for healing, for renewal. It was a sentiment that echoed in the quiet moments of the war's aftermath, a reminder that peace, when it arrived, would not come in the form of flags raised or treaties signed, but in the quiet, human connections that arose from shared suffering. The convoy, now loaded with the last of their supplies, began its slow departure. But unlike the first time the villagers had heard the sound of engines in the distance, the road was filled with different sounds this time. The laughter of children, the murmur of conversation, the whisper of hope. Martia stood at the edge of the village, holding Emil's hand tightly, watching the convoy disappear beyond the ridge. The silence returned, but it was no longer the oppressive, empty silence of despair. It was a silence filled with the echoes of humanity, of kindness, and of something larger than the war itself, something that could not be measured by victory or defeat, but only by the simple act of survival and the promise that peace could begin with small gestures of grace. When the convoy left, the village was left in a strange, tentative quiet. The rumble of the trucks faded into the distance, but the echoes of what had just happened lingered, filling the air with something almost foreign, a sense of relief. For the first time in months, the villagers no longer whispered in fear, their minds no longer consumed by the possibility of violence. Instead, they stood together, united by the shared experience of mercy, something that had been absent from their lives for so long. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. The American soldiers had promised to return, but the villagers could hardly believe it. Would the Americans come back with more food, more blankets? Or was this simply an illusion, a fleeting moment of kindness before the cruel hand of war returned? Yet, as the weeks passed, the convoy did return, and with it came more food, more supplies, and more moments of connection. The children, who had once played in the streets with tin cans, now waved eagerly at the trucks as they approached. The men who had once eyed the Americans with suspicion now spoke to them in broken German, exchanging stories and simple gestures. It was as though a veil had been lifted, and the division between enemy and villager began to blur. For Martia, the impact was profoundly personal. In her hands, she held not just the provisions they needed to survive, but the symbol of something deeper. hope. With each passing visit, she watched as the villagers slowly began to rebuild. The fields that had once been barren were now being tilled once more. The houses, though still damaged, began to see the light of fire and warmth again. In her own home, Martia found herself cooking meals not out of necessity, but out of the ability to care for Emil. For the first time in years, she felt the faint stirrings of something like normality, as if the world had started to turn once again. The church bell, once frozen in place, now rang again, a sound that had been absent for so long. It was a small but significant sign that the village was healing, that life was returning to a place that had almost been forgotten by history. As the bell tolled, Martia thought of the soldiers who had brought them not just food, but the kind of kindness she had thought lost forever. But the transformation was not instant. The scars of war, the bitterness of years spent under the shadow of Nazi ideology, could not be erased so easily. Even as the villagers accepted the food, the blankets, and the aid, not everyone was ready to embrace the change. There were still those like Kruger, the former party official, who could not let go of the pride that had been instilled in him during the war. He saw the Americans not as saviors, but as a symbol of defeat. He muttered bitterly that the villagers were begging from the enemy, a sentiment that, though quietly shared by some, was not the prevailing attitude. Despite Kruger's words, the majority of the villagers found themselves caught between their old beliefs and the new reality. The promise of peace, of rebuilding, was not without its challenges. Some still feared the unknown, unsure if the Americans' kindness was genuine, or if it was merely another phase in a war that had already cost them so much. Months passed, and the village began to heal in ways that no one could have predicted. The Americans kept their word, returning again and again with supplies, and with each visit, the trust between the soldiers and the villagers deepened. The food they brought was not just a means of survival, it was a symbol of peace, of reconciliation. For Martia, the arrival of the convoy each time became a moment of reflection. She would stand at the edge of the village, watching the trucks roll in, and she would think back to the first time they had come. The fear that had gripped her heart had slowly turned into gratitude. And with that gratitude came a realization. Peace, when it came, would not be perfect. It would be imperfect, fragile, and slow, but it was something worth fighting for. She found herself hoping not just for the survival of her family, but for the survival of the future, for a world where children like Emil could grow up without knowing the horrors of war. The people of the village began to rebuild their lives, but not just physically. As the years went on, the memories of the American soldiers and the kindness they had shown would linger, often whispered about among the older generation. The story of how the enemy had come with food instead of fire, with mercy instead of cruelty, became a part of the village's collective memory. The message was clear. Even in the darkest moments, humanity could still shine through. The war had taken so much, but it had also given them something they hadn't expected, a new understanding of what it meant to be human, to be kind, and to forgive. The bitterness that had once consumed the village gave way, bit by bit, to a quiet acceptance of the soldiers' gifts. The children, who had once played with tin cans, now ran through the streets laughing, their footsteps light and free. As the years passed, Martia's life slowly found its rhythm again. The war had taken so much from her, but it had not taken her capacity for hope. The pain of losing her husband, of watching the world crumble around her, would never fully go away. But as Emil grew older, she began to see in him the promise of a different world. A world where food was not a luxury, where laughter did not feel like a distant memory, and where kindness was not a rare commodity, but a way of life. And though the war had left scars that would never fade, the village, in its quiet way, learned to rebuild, not just its homes and fields, but its heart. In the quiet aftermath of war, there are no easy answers, no neatly tied ends. The scars of conflict linger long after the last shots have been fired, and the quiet resettles over the land once torn apart by violence. Yet, it is often in the aftermath, in the moments when the dust settles, that we find the truest measure of humanity. The village in Bavaria, once caught in the grip of war and propaganda, was reborn not through victory or defeat, but through the simple act of giving. The soldiers who arrived with nothing but rations and blankets gave far more than they realized, offering not just food, but the possibility of reconciliation. In a world broken by years of hatred, they had delivered a message that transcended the uniforms they wore: mercy, kindness, and the belief that even in the darkest of times, humanity could still find its way. Martia's journey, like that of so many others in the village, was not just about survival. It was about reclaiming what it meant to be human. Through the eyes of a mother, she saw not the enemy, but a shared longing for peace, for hope, for something more than destruction. In the moment that the American soldiers handed her son Emile a tin of milk, something deep within her shifted. The war had tried to rob them of their humanity, but in that small act, in that tiny offering, she found what had been missing for so long. For the soldiers, too, the experience was transformative. They had crossed battlefields and fought against an enemy they were told was evil. But here, on this small patch of snow-covered ground, they were faced with the reality that the enemy was not an abstract concept. It was a human being, a mother, a child, someone who, just like them, had endured unimaginable hardship. The lessons of this moment would echo through the years, both in the memories of the villagers and in the hearts of the soldiers who had been there. The true cost of war is not measured in victories or losses, but in the lives it shatters, the families it breaks, and the trust it destroys. And yet, even after all the destruction, even after everything that had been lost, something remained: the ability to forgive, to rebuild, and to see the humanity in others. No matter the uniform they wore, the village may have been destroyed by the war, but it was rebuilt not just with bricks and mortar, but with kindness, compassion, and the understanding that peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of humanity in all its forms. And in that quiet, snowy village, as the years passed and the war became a distant memory, the lessons of mercy and forgiveness remained, passed down from one generation to the next. Martia's reflection as she stood in her kitchen, holding the letter from the American mother, is a reminder of what it means to truly build peace. It is not an abstract ideal, but a series of small human gestures. And in those moments of kindness, in the simplest of acts, peace begins. Not with flags or treaties, but with shared humanity. For the villagers, the war had ended not with the signing of a peace treaty, but with the quiet return of life. In the laughter of children, in the smell of bread baked in the ovens once again, in the soft, fleeting memory of a soldier who gave his last loaf of bread to a stranger. This was the true victory, the one that would outlast the weapons, the armies, and the ideologies. And perhaps, in the end, that is how peace truly begins. Not with great triumphs or speeches, but with the small, humble moments where we learn to see each other, not as enemies, but as people again.